8 years of sacrifice, each payment a silent scream. The house I worked for never became mine, just a tomb for my hopes and dreams. The bank statement felt like a venomous snake coiled in my hand, each digit a tiny, lethal bite. 8 years. 8 years of bleeding my finances dry, all for a house that wasn't mine. A house where memories were supposed to blossom, where laughter should have echoed like chimes. But instead, it turned out to be a monument of betrayal. Chad. Even his name tasted like ash on my tongue. He was the golden child, the paragon of filial piety, while I was relegated to the role of the argumentative son, the perpetual disappointment. Now, the full weight of their machinations crushed me. Chad, with his syrupy charm and hollow promises, had stolen what I earned. And my parents? They stood by, complicit, even supportive of his deception. Selfish, they'd hissed when I finally snapped, when I refused to throw another dollar into the gaping maw of their, what? Their comfort? Their delusion? Their carefully constructed narrative of Chad's superiority? The word echoed in my head, each syllable a nail hammered into the coffin of my shattered trust. For 8 years, I'd meticulously transferred funds each month, a silent vow to repay my parents' sacrifices. Robert, my father, a man weathered by years of thankless factory work, and Karen, my mother, who had tirelessly sewn my Halloween costumes, packed my lunches, and bandaged my scraped knees. I wanted to alleviate their anxieties, to let them savor their twilight years without the gnawing fear of financial ruin. I envisioned lazy afternoons on the porch swing, tending to the roses Karen adored, and Robert finally indulging in his passion for woodworking. How naive I'd been. I had blinded myself to the insidious truth, the subtle shifts in allegiance, the way Chad slithered into their affections, poisoning them against me. Was I so desperate for their approval that I ignored the warning signs? Or was I simply too trusting, too ready to believe in the inherent goodness of my family? The questions clawed at me, relentless and unforgiving. Karen had married Chad's father when I was barely 10. Mark, Chad's father, was a smooth-talking salesman with a perpetual tan and a repertoire of corny jokes that somehow charmed her. He was the antithesis of my own taciturn father, a man of few words but unwavering integrity. Mark brought Chad into our lives, a precocious, blonde-haired boy with an uncanny ability to mimic adult behavior. Almost immediately, the dynamic shifted. Suddenly, I wasn't the sole focus of their attention. I began to notice that Chad was treated with a leniency I never experienced. If I questioned a rule, I was deemed disrespectful. If Chad did, he was simply asserting himself. It was subtle, insidious, like a slow-acting poison seeping into the foundation of our family. I recall one instance vividly. I had accidentally broken Karen's favorite vase, a delicate porcelain piece she'd inherited from her grandmother. The punishment was swift and severe, grounded for a month, no television, no phone. A week later, Chad, while playing baseball in the house, shattered a window. His punishment? A stern lecture and a promise to be more careful. The discrepancy stung. It wasn't just about the broken vase or the shattered window. It was about the underlying message. Chad was favored, valued more than me. It was a message that reverberated throughout my childhood and into my adulthood. As the years passed, Chad perfected his performance of the ideal son. He excelled in school, or so they claimed, volunteered at the local soup kitchen, during the holidays of course, and always had a kind word for Karen and Robert. Meanwhile, I immersed myself in academics, devoured books, and challenged the status quo. I questioned their beliefs, debated their decisions, and dared to have opinions that differed from theirs. In their eyes, this made me difficult, rebellious, ungrateful. They failed to see that my questioning stemmed from a genuine desire to understand the world, to make it a better place. They dismissed my intellectual curiosity as arrogance, my passion as defiance. Now, sitting alone in my sterile apartment, surrounded by the debris of my shattered illusions, I understood. Chad wasn't just playing a role, he was weaponizing it. He had expertly manipulated my parents' insecurities and desires, transforming himself into the son they always wanted, the son they always wished I could be. When Robert and Karen retired, they presented me with a proposition: help with the mortgage and property taxes. "It's a family legacy," Robert said, his voice thick with sentimentality. "We're doing this for all of us, for future generations." I readily agreed, envisioning a sanctuary for family gatherings, a place where we could all grow old together, surrounded by love and laughter. I saw it as a way to solidify my place within the family, to finally earn their unwavering approval. Chad, of course, contributed nothing. He was too busy pursuing his passions, which translated to bouncing from one dead-end job to another, always blaming external circumstances for his failures. My parents never pressured him. After all, he was an artist, a free spirit, not bound by the mundane concerns of financial responsibility. It was a year ago that Chad lost his current job as a bartender, after which he was immediately welcomed back into the family home. What I assumed was a temporary arrangement suddenly became a full-blown occupation when I learned that he was not only there to stay, but they had also signed the house over to him. I had lived my life under the impression that the property would be sold and split evenly among those remaining after their death, myself included. I knew that was foolish. It should have been so obvious. I confronted them, armed with years of resentment and a desperate plea for understanding. Their response was a carefully rehearsed performance of wounded innocence. "Sentimental value," Karen had declared, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Chad deserves a home. He's always been there for us." "Material things aren't important, David," Robert added, his voice laced with disappointment. "You're so focused on money. You need to learn to appreciate what truly matters." What truly mattered? Was it the years of financial burden I had carried? Was it the sacrifices I had made to ensure their comfort? Was it the emotional toll of constantly striving for their approval, only to be met with indifference or criticism? That was when I made the decision to stop paying the mortgage. If the house belonged to Chad, then he could shoulder the responsibility. Let him experience the anxiety of looming deadlines, the burden of unexpected repairs, the constant pressure of maintaining a home. Predictably, my parents were furious. "This is not the right time to do this," Karen had wailed. "Your brother is struggling." Not once did they acknowledge my struggles, the sacrifices I had already made. Chad, ever the master manipulator, played the victim to perfection. "You're tearing the family apart over money," he accused, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "I can't believe you would do this to Mom and Dad." The irony was staggering. He was the one who had manipulated them, who had driven a wedge between me and my parents, who had stolen my inheritance. Yet, he was casting me as the villain, the destroyer of familial harmony. I knew that I couldn't let it end there. I had to fight back, to expose their lies and reclaim what was rightfully mine. I had to prove that I wasn't the selfish, ungrateful son they believed me to be. The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. Rifling through my financial records, I stumbled upon an old letter from the bank, tucked away in a dusty folder. Chad's name was listed on the property deed, not as a recent addition, but as a co-owner dating back several years. The world tilted. The air seemed to thin, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. This wasn't just favoritism, it was a calculated act of betrayal. They had given him the house while I was still paying for it, stringing me along, using me as a financial crutch while secretly plotting against me. Sleep offered no respite. My mind became a battlefield, replaying years of interactions, searching for clues I had missed, moments where the truth had been hidden in plain sight. I saw Chad's sly glances, my parents' evasive answers, the subtle shifts in their behavior that now screamed of deception. The house was never mine. It had always been part of some insidious scheme, a cruel game in which I was a pawn. I had been so blind, so desperate for their love, that I had willingly walked into their trap. Driven by a desperate need for answers, I confronted them the following morning. The facade of normalcy crumbled the moment I stepped through the door. Karen's smile faltered, Robert's eyes darted nervously, and Chad's smirk became a mask of thinly veiled anxiety. "We need to talk," I said, my voice tight with suppressed rage. They tried to deflect, to minimize, to gaslight me into believing that I was overreacting. But I wouldn't be silenced. I presented them with the evidence, the bank letter, the undeniable proof of their treachery. Robert attempted to justify their actions, claiming that he was only ensuring the house remained in the family. He spun a narrative of my supposed selfishness, arguing that I would sell the house and abandon them in their old age. "You mean you're making sure it stays yours?" I retorted, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "You didn't pay a dime for this place, and yet somehow it's magically yours now." Karen, her eyes red-rimmed, whispered about their debt to Chad, how he had always been the one who looked after them, the one who never questioned their decisions. "And you don't trust me?" I asked, my voice cracking with pain. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the confirmation of my deepest fears. the validation of my lifelong sense of being an outsider in my own family. Chad, emboldened by their unwavering support, delivered the final blow. "Look, David, I'm just doing what's best," he said, his voice smooth and condescending. "If the house were in your name, we both know what would happen. You'd sell it, take the money, and leave our parents with nothing." I felt like I had been sucker punched. I had sacrificed my own financial security for them, and they believed I was capable of such callousness. The injustice of it was overwhelming. I turned to Chad, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a flicker of triumph in his eyes. He reveled in my pain, in my humiliation. "You're unbelievable," I whispered, my voice trembling with rage. "All these years, I was the bad guy in your little story, wasn't I?" He offered a fake sympathetic smile. "It's not personal, David. It's just reality." Reality? His reality was built on lies, manipulation, and the unwavering complicity of my parents. My reality was one of betrayal, of shattered trust, of being cast aside for a charlatan. At that moment, something within me snapped. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I had spent my life seeking their approval, but now I realized that their approval was worthless. I needed justice, and I would fight for it, even if it meant tearing our family apart. As I stormed out of the house, I heard Chad's mocking laughter echoing behind me. He thought he had won. He had no idea what I was capable of. Driven by a burning desire for retribution, I sought legal counsel. I explained the situation to Jessica, a sharp, pragmatic lawyer who had been a classmate of mine in law school. She listened intently, her expression growing increasingly grim as I recounted the details of my parents' betrayal and Chad's manipulation. "This is a complicated situation, David," she said after I had finished. "But you have a strong case. You have proof that you were the one paying the mortgage and property taxes for all those years. You have a right to seek financial compensation. I filed a lawsuit demanding that the house be sold and my investment returned." The news sent shockwaves through my family. Chad erupted in a tirade of threats and insults. Karen pleaded with me to drop the suit, claiming that it was tearing our family apart. Robert remained silent, his face etched with a mixture of anger and disappointment. The lawsuit became a public spectacle. The details splashed across local news outlets and social media. Family members and friends took sides. Whispers and rumors spread like wildfire, and the once harmonious facade of our family crumbled into a heap of recriminations and accusations. Amidst the chaos, I received an unexpected phone call from Aunt Rebecca, Karen's cousin. I hadn't spoken to her in years, but she had always been kind to me, a quiet observer of our family dynamics. "David," she said, her voice trembling, "I need to tell you something. It's about Chad." My stomach clenched. I braced myself for another revelation, another layer of deceit. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "Chad isn't your real brother." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. I struggled to make sense of them. "What do you mean?" I asked, my mind racing. "He's not related to your parents," she explained. "He's not your father's son. He's not your mother's son. He's not your brother at all." I felt like I was plummeting into a bottomless abyss. The foundations of my family, already weakened by betrayal and lies, completely disintegrated. "That doesn't make any sense," I stammered. "They raised him. They love him." "I know," Rebecca said. "That's the sick part. They never told you the truth. They took him in when he was a baby. They raised him as their own, but David, he always knew." The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The favoritism, the blind loyalty, the way Chad had always made me the scapegoat, it all made sense now. "Why didn't they tell me?" I asked, my voice filled with anguish. "Because they were ashamed," Rebecca said. "They wanted to pretend it wasn't real, and he played along until now." The realization was devastating. My entire life had been built on a lie. I had been denied the truth, manipulated into believing that Chad was my brother, my equal, when in reality, he was nothing more than a charlatan, an imposter who had stolen my place in the family. "So what?" I asked, my voice filled with bitterness. "He manipulated them his whole life just to take the house?" Rebecca sighed. "I think so. And I think he always planned this. David, he's been playing the long game, making himself the perfect son, making you the villain, so that when the time came, they would choose him. They had chosen him over me, over their own flesh and blood. The pain was unbearable. I felt like I had been stripped bare, exposed to the elements, left to fend for myself in a world that had suddenly become alien and hostile. Armed with Rebecca's revelation, I confronted my parents again. This time, I didn't plead or argue. I simply presented them with the truth, forcing them to acknowledge the lie they had perpetuated for so long. They denied it at first, claiming that Rebecca was a disgruntled old woman, that her accusations were baseless. But I saw the fear in their eyes, the way they avoided my gaze, the subtle tremors in their hands. I pressed them, relentlessly, until their facade crumbled. Karen broke down in tears, confessing that they had taken Chad in when he was a baby, after his mother, a distant relative, had died. They had always intended to tell me the truth, she said, but the right moment never seemed to arise. Robert remained stoic, his face a mask of shame and regret. He admitted that they had favored Chad, that they had always felt a sense of guilt for not being his biological parents. They had tried to compensate, to make up for his loss, by showering him with affection and opportunities. "But you had me," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "You had a son who loved you, who sacrificed for you. Why wasn't that enough?" They had no answer. Their silence was a deafening indictment, a confirmation of their betrayal. I turned to Chad, who had been silently observing the confrontation, his face pale and drawn. "You knew, didn't you?" I asked, my voice dripping with contempt. "You knew all along that you weren't my brother, that you were just an imposter." He didn't deny it. He simply shrugged, his eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and regret. "So, what if I did?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They loved me more than they ever loved you. I was the son they always wanted." His words were like a knife twisting in my gut. I wanted to lash out, to strike him, to silence him forever. But I knew that violence wouldn't solve anything. It would only validate their perception of me as the angry, rebellious son. Instead, I took a deep breath, forcing myself to remain calm. "You're right, Chad," I said, my voice steady. "They may have loved you more than they loved me, but that doesn't make you their son, and it doesn't make you entitled to anything." I turned to my parents, my heart aching with a mixture of pain and disappointment. "I'm done," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm done trying to earn your love. I'm done trying to be the son you want me to be. I'm walking away from this family, from this house, from this lie." I turned and walked out of the house, leaving them to wallow in their guilt and regret. I didn't look back. I knew that there was nothing left for me there. The lawsuit dragged on for months, a bitter and protracted battle that consumed my life. Chad fought back with a ferocity I hadn't anticipated, hiring a high-powered lawyer and launching a smear campaign against me. He accused me of being a greedy, vindictive son, obsessed with money and determined to destroy our family. He painted himself as the innocent victim, the selfless caregiver who had always put my parents' needs first. My parents, torn between their loyalty to Chad and their guilt towards me, wavered. They testified in court, their stories shifting and changing, their words carefully chosen to minimize their own culpability. The trial was a grueling and emotionally draining experience. I was subjected to relentless cross-examination, my character and motivations scrutinized under a microscope. I had to relive the pain of my childhood, the years of neglect and favoritism, the constant struggle to earn my parents' approval. But I persevered. I presented the evidence, the bank statements, the emails, the witnesses who testified to my sacrifices, and Chad's manipulative behavior. I exposed the truth, revealing the lies and deceit that had been festering beneath the surface of our family for so long. In the end, the judge ruled in my favor. He ordered that the house be sold and my investment returned. He condemned Chad's actions as fraudulent and opportunistic, and reprimanded my parents for their complicity in the scheme. The victory was bittersweet. I had won the battle, but I had lost my family in the process. My parents were devastated, their reputation tarnished, their relationship with Chad irrevocably broken. Chad, stripped of his ill-gotten gains, disappeared, leaving behind a trail of resentment and broken promises. I was left alone, with a sum of money that couldn't replace the love and acceptance I had always craved. I had achieved justice, but at what cost? In the aftermath of the trial, I moved to a new city, seeking a fresh start, a chance to rebuild my life away from the wreckage of my past. I threw myself into my work, immersing myself in the challenges of my legal practice. I tried to forget about my family, to bury the memories of betrayal and pain. But the past had a way of haunting me, of seeping into my dreams and coloring my waking hours. I received occasional updates about my parents from Aunt Rebecca, They were struggling, both financially and emotionally. They had lost their home, their savings, and their sense of purpose. They were estranged from Chad, who had refused to acknowledge their existence. I felt a pang of guilt, a flicker of compassion for their suffering, but I quickly suppressed it. They had made their choices, and they had to live with the consequences. One day, Rebecca called me with news that stopped me in my tracks. Karen had been diagnosed with cancer. It was aggressive and advanced, and the doctors gave her only a few months to live. The news hit me hard. Despite everything, Karen was still my mother. I remembered her warmth, her kindness, the sacrifices she had made for me when I was a child. I hesitated, torn between my resentment and my sense of filial duty. Should I reach out to her? Should I offer my support? Should I forgive her for her past transgressions? After days of agonizing deliberation, I decided to visit her. I drove back to my hometown, my heart pounding with anxiety and anticipation. When I arrived at their small, rented apartment, I found Karen frail and weak, her eyes sunk and her skin pale. Robert sat by her side, his face etched with grief and exhaustion. They were surprised to see me, their expressions a mixture of hope and apprehension. I sat down beside Karen, taking her hand in mine. It was cold and bony, a stark reminder of her mortality. We talked for hours, reminiscing about the past, sharing memories of happier times. Karen apologized for her past mistakes, for the favoritism she had shown towards Chad, for the pain she had caused me. "I was wrong, David," she said, her voice weak but sincere. "I let my guilt cloud my judgment. I thought I was protecting Chad, but I ended up hurting you. I'm so sorry." I forgave her. I had carried the burden of my resentment for too long. It was time to let go, to heal the wounds of the past. Robert also apologized, admitting that he had been blinded by his own insecurities and prejudices. He acknowledged that I had always been a good son, that I had always done my best to make them proud. "I love you, David," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm so grateful that you came back." We spent the next few weeks together, making the most of our limited time. I helped care for Karen, cooking her meals, reading her books, and simply holding her hand. She died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by her family. Her death brought us closer together. Robert and I began to rebuild our relationship, forging a new bond based on honesty and understanding. In the years that followed, I learned to forgive myself for my past mistakes. I realized that I couldn't change what had happened, but I could choose how I reacted to it. I focused on building a life of purpose and meaning. I continued to work as a lawyer, advocating for the rights of the marginalized and the oppressed. I volunteered my time at local charities, helping those in need. I found love again, with a woman who saw me for who I was, flaws and all. We built a life together, filled with laughter, compassion, and mutual respect. I never heard from Chad again. He remained a ghost in our family history, a reminder of the damage that secrets and lies can inflict. I never fully understood why my parents had chosen to favor him, to perpetuate the lie that had haunted my childhood. Perhaps it was out of guilt, perhaps it was out of a desire to protect him, or perhaps it was simply because they were flawed human beings, capable of making terrible mistakes. But I learned to accept their imperfections. I realized that they had done the best they could, given their own limitations and experiences. In the end, I found peace. I healed the wounds of my past and embraced the possibility of a brighter future. I learned that forgiveness is not about condoning wrongdoing, but about freeing yourself from the burden of resentment. I emerged from the gilded cage of my family history, stronger, wiser, and more resilient than ever before. I had survived the betrayal, the lies, and the pain. And I had emerged victorious, not because I had won the battle, but because I had learned to forgive, to let go, and to embrace the possibility of a new dawn.